Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Cut Rate Commander, the series in which we take a look at low-price commanders and make budget decks with them. My name is Grazzet, and today we'll be looking at the unlikely Cathar and Spirit duo of Rhoda, Geist Avenger, and Timin, Youthful Geist. Before we continue, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you like this content and would like me to continue making more videos like this in the future. And if you're feeling particularly generous, consider buying me a coffee at the link in the description to keep me caffeinated while I work on these builds. Also, be sure to stick around until the end of the video to see who won last week's poll and what commanders from Crimson Vow you'll be voting for an upcoming episode. So with that out of the way, let's start by taking a look at the commander and playstyle. Rhoda, Geist Avenger is a 3/3 human soldier with vigilance and partner with Timin, Youthful Geist that costs 3 and a white with the following ability. Whenever a creature an opponent controls becomes tapped, if it isn't being declared as an attacker, put a +1/+1 counter on Rhoda, Geist Avenger. Timin, Youthful Geist is a 3/4 spirit with flying and partner with Rhoda, Geist Avenger that costs 4 and a blue with the following ability. At the beginning of each combat, tap up to 1 target creature. Looking at our partner commanders, we can see that they both possess mid-size CMCs, Rhoda possessing more reasonable stats for her cost, but Timin being evasive to make up for his comparatively worse stat block, and both possess abilities focused on tapping down our opponent's creatures. Looking at Rhoda first, her +1/+1 counter generation focused around tapping down our opponent's creatures make her a surprisingly quick-growing threat, not only benefiting from our own tap-down effects, but also when our opponents use mana dorks, pingers, or any other effects that require them to tap down creatures to activate, quickly bringing Rhoda in range of killing our opponents through commander damage, providing we have enough sources of continual tap-down and means to protect her. Luckily, her partner Timin is a great source of tap-down by doing so every combat step, which not only grows Rhoda if she's on board, but also screens attacks against us or opens up our opponent's defenses to leave them vulnerable to attacks. And since this is a May trigger, it gives us some political sway throughout the course of the game, as if our opponents want to be able to swing in with their biggest creature, they'll have to negotiate with us in order to do so. So clearly, this build will be a tap-down focused one, aiming to tap down our opponent's creatures frequently to grow Rhoda, thus enabling her to knock out our opponents through commander damage, while preventing our opponent's creatures from swinging into us. That means we'll be running plenty of cheap and free tap effects to keep our opponent's creatures down, as well as payoffs to generate us extra value as we do so. And of course, since Rhoda is going to be our primary source of damage, we'll be running plenty of counterspells to disrupt any spells that may be headed her way, as well as sources of protection to grant her hexproof and indestructible to make it difficult for our opponents to be able to interact with her. From there, all we need to do is keep tapping down our opponent's creatures with Timin and our other tap-down effects, and eventually they'll fall under Rhoda's onslaught of commander damage. So let's see what these two unlikely partners can do, flesh and spirit against anything Innistrad can throw at them. Together, these two have faced insane cultists, tormented spirits, and even corrupted angels, overcoming these foes together where individually they would have failed. So let's see if our opponents can stand up against their teamwork, or if they'll fall like all the rest. So now that we know a bit more about the commander and playstyle, let's start looking at the deck itself by starting with the creatures. Starting in the CMC1 slot, we have some tap-down sources with Giant Killer, Gideon's Lockkeeper, and Gold Meadow Harrier. Giant Killer is a 1/2 that we can pay 1 a white and tap it to tap target creature, as well as being castable for its adventure side, Chop Down, an instant which costs 2 and a white to destroy target creature with power 4 or greater, serving as a decent source of creature removal that later gives us a continual source of tap down at a reasonable rate. Gideon's Lockkeeper and Gold Meadow Harrier are both 1/1s that we can pay a white and tap to tap target creature, both providing us with some cheap bodies to drop early and continually provide cheap creature tapping to grow our commander and disrupt our opponent's board states at instant speed. Then we close out this slot with Geist, a 1/1 flyer that, when it ETBs, taps target creature an opponent controls, and, if Delirium is active, lets us tap down an opponent's creature on each of their upkeeps, giving us another early drop that effectively becomes an extra copy of Timin once our graveyard fills up for additional tap down. Moving on to the CMC2 slot, we have its 3 spectral entrants with Niblis of the Urn, Shacklegeist, and Ghostly Pilferer. Niblis of the Urn is a 1/1 flyer that, whenever it attacks, taps target creature, making it a decent evasive body to attack in with that makes it easier for our non-evasive creatures to get in for damage. Shacklegeist is a 2/2 flyer that can only block flying creatures and lets us tap 2 spirits to tap a creature we don't control, working nicely with Timin to tap down more targets, clearing the way for Rhoda to get in for commander damage and growing her in the process. Ghostly Pilferer is a 1/2 that lets us discard a card to make it unblockable, draws us a card whenever an opponent casts a spell from anywhere other than their hand, and lets us pay 2 whenever it untaps to draw a card, giving us a decent draw source to swing in with when it's safe, or we can tap down with our own tap effects when it's not, while also giving us value if our opponents decide to cast spells from exile or from the grave. The CMC3 slot then starts off with Distracting Geist, Territorial Hammerskull, and Master of Diversion, all 3 of which tap a creature whenever they attack, The first being a 2/1 that has to target a creature the defending player controls and has Disturb for 4 and a white, which turns it into an enchantment aura which grants the same ability to the enchanted creature. The second being a 2/3 that can tap down any creature when it attacks. And the last being a 2/2 that's also limited to the defending player's creatures, giving us a nice suite of offensive tap-down creatures to help clear the path of blockers for Rhoda to deliver the finishing blow. Minister of Impediments and Nimbless of Breath then join us as another pair of creatures that can tap themselves to tap any other creature, the former being a 1/1 that costs nothing to do this, and the latter being a 2/1 flyer that costs a blue to do this, but it can also untap a creature instead, both giving us some additional instant speed disruption for little to no cost. Even more tap-down effects then join us as we move deeper into this slot with Nebelgast Herald, Dreamshackle Geist, and Gadwick the Wizened. Nebelgast Herald is a 2/1 flyer that, whenever it or another spirit ETBs under our control, lets us tap down a creature we don't control, weaponizing our decent number of spirits to further our tap-down focused game plan. Dreamshackle Geist is a 3/1 flyer that, at the start of our combat phase, lets us either tap target creature or prevent target tapped creature from untapping during its controller's next untap step, providing us with further means to tap down creatures or keep them tapped down if necessary, while also possessing a good evasive stat line to swing in with. Gadwick the Wizened is a 3/3 spell that draws us X cards when cast and, whenever we play a blue spell, taps down target non-land permanents an opponent controls, serving initially as a good scalable source of card draw to replenish our hands, that we can later use to further disrupt our opponent's creatures and other permanents as we cast our spells. Then we have a pair of white entrants joining our ranks with Gideon's Avenger and Bastion Protector. Gideon's Avenger is a 2/2 that, whenever a creature an opponent controls becomes tapped, gets a +1/+1 counter, giving us an even better version of our commander's ability that grows it even in response to combat, which we can use alongside Rhoda to pump some serious damage into our opponent's life totals. Bastion Protector is a 3/3 that gives our commander creatures +2/+2 and indestructible so long as it remains on the field, both providing our commanders with potent protection and pumping their stats to make it easier for them to end the game through commander damage. Then closing out this slot we have Burnished Heart, a 2/2 that we can pay 3 and sack to put 2 basic lands from our deck into play tapped, serving as a good source of land-based ramp to keep our mana base growing nicely. Reaching the CMC4 slot, we have yet more tap-down effects starting us off with Heliod's Emissary, Ballynock Trapper, and Fate Stitcher. Heliod's Emissary is a 3/3 enchantment creature with Bestow for 6 and a white that, whenever it or the enchanted creature attacks, taps target creature an opponent controls and, if it's an aura, gives the enchanted creature +3/+3, giving us a decent source of offensive creature tapping if it drops early, or giving Rhoda a decent stat boost in its tap-down effect if used later, with the benefit of leaving itself behind if Rhoda is dealt with. Ballynock Trapper is a 2/2 that we can tap to tap target creature and untaps itself whenever we play a white spell, potentially allowing us to tap multiple targets back-to-back on a single turn at no additional cost, provided we have the white spells to cast. Fate Stitcher is a 1/2 with Unearth for a blue that we can tap to either tap or untap target permanent, serving as some decent free disruption for our opponent sources or a way to give ourselves ramp or untap our creatures depending on what we need at the moment, which can also bring itself back from the grave for one last tap or untap on the cheap when needed. Tempest Caller then also joins us, a 2/3 that, when it ETBs, taps all creatures target opponent controls, its player-specific AoE tap-down effect leaving an opponent wide open while powering up Rhoda significantly, potentially allowing her to knock them out of the game through commander damage. Finally, we end this slot with Icing Death Frost Tyrant, a 4/3 flyer with Vigilance that, when it dies, creates Frost Tongue, a legendary artifact equipment token that equips for 2, gives the equipped creature +2/+0, and, when it attacks, taps down a creature the defending player controls, starting off as a potent offensive and defensive threat that, if dealt with, gives us even more tap down that's particularly good when equipped to Rhoda to boost her stats even further, while also enabling her to proc her own growth. Skipping to the CMC6 slot, we have its 3 entrants with Frost Titan, Sunblast Angel, and Sentinel of the Eternal Watch. Frost Titan is a 6/6 with effectively Ward 2 that, when it attacks, taps target permanent and doesn't allow its controller to untap it on their next untap step, giving us a huge stat block with a lingering tap-down effect to go on the offensive with, that's annoying for our opponents to deal with thanks to its ward-like protection. Sunblast Angel is a 4/5 flyer that, when it ETBs, destroys all tapped creatures, effectively serving as a one-sided board wipe for our build when we no longer need to keep our opponent's creatures around to tap them, or if they're too dangerous to be kept alive, which comes with a decent-sized evasive body to swing in with once the smoke clears. Sentinel of the Eternal Watch is a 4/6 with Vigilance that, at the beginning of combat on each of our opponent's turns, taps down a creature that player controls, making it an additional copy of Timin to give us continual tap-downs on each of our opponent's turns again and again, preventing attacks with its tap-down effect while blocking others with its defensive stat block. Finally, reaching the CMC7 slot and our final creature, we have Ojatai, Soul of Winter, a 5/6 flyer with Vigilance that, whenever a dragon we control attacks, taps target non-land permanents an opponent controls and prevents it from untapping on the opponent's next untap step. Serving as our last offensive source of Tapdown that's both on good offense and defense thanks to its stat block and keywords that, while expensive, lets us freeze problematic permanents of all kinds for some very solid and repeatable disruption. That covers all our creatures, so let's move on to our instance. Starting in the CMC1 slot, we have a pair of blue entrants with Bluster Squall and You See a Guard Approach. Bluster Squall lets us tap a creature we don't control and can be overloaded for 3 and a blue, giving us an instant speed way to tap down the entire board when overloaded, growing Rhoda massively all at once while simultaneously leaving all our opponents wide open. You See a Guard Approach either lets us tap target creature or give target creature we control hexproof until end of turn, making it a cheap source of targeted removal protection for Rhoda, and, if she's protected by other means, still lets us use it as a source of tap down for further disruption. Entering the CMC2 slot, we have its 3 entrants with Counterspell, Arcane Denial, and Dovin's Veto, all 3 of which counter target spell, the first being able to counter anything, the second also countering anything but letting the countered spell's controller draw 2 while we draw 1 on the next upkeep, and the last countering only non-creature spells but being uncounterable itself, giving us a decent selection of cheap and efficient spell disruption to make sure Rhoda stays alive or preventing our opponent's plans from going off. Moving on to the CMC3 slot, we have its 2 entrants with Saw It Coming and Sphinx's Revelation. Saw It Coming counters target spell and has Foretell for 1 and a blue, making it a decent counterspell if hardcast but really shining if foretold to effectively serve as another copy of counterspell that we can drop early then use as needed. Sphinx's Revelation is an X spell that draws us X cards and gains us X life, serving as a scalable instant speed card draw source that we can use when we don't need to use open mana to protect ourselves that pads our life totals as a bonus. Finally, reaching the CMC4 slot in our last instant, we have Behold the Multiverse, which lets us scry 2, then draw 2, and has Foretell for 1 and a blue, being okay if hardcast, but great when foretold to get us some respectable card selection and card draw in the early game. That covers all our instance, so let's move on to our sorceries. Skipping to the CMC2 slot, we have Hands of Binding and Hidden Strings, both of which have Cipher and let us tap down a permanent, the former being limited to our opponent's creatures and preventing them from untapping during their controller's next untap step, and the latter tapping or untapping any permanent then repeating the effect, giving us yet more sources of tapping that we can get extra value out of again and again once ciphered onto our creatures as they swing in. The CMC3 slot then brings us Borrowing 100,000 Arrows and Theft of Dreams, both of which draw us a card for each tapped creature target opponent controls, serving as potent tap-down matters payoffs in the form of card advantage that can easily refill our hands for a relatively low cost. Moving on to the CMC4 slot, we have Sleep, which taps all creatures target opponent controls and prevents them from untapping during that player's next untap step, freezing an opponent's whole board and leaving them wide open for attacks from both ourselves and their other opponents for a full turn. Finally, reaching the CMC5 slot, we have our last sorcery with Bond of Discipline, which taps all creatures our opponents control and gives lifelink to all our creatures until end of turn. Its board-wide AoE tap-down effect providing Rhoda with an enormous stat boost, while simultaneously leaving all our opponents wide open for an attack from her, and even tacking on some lifelink for a huge amount of life gain as a bonus. That covers all our sorceries, so let's move on to our enchantments. The CMC1 slot starts us off with its only entrant, Betrayal, an aura which can only be played on our opponent's creatures, and draws us a card whenever the enchanted creature becomes tapped, serving as a cheap and fairly consistent way for us to generate card advantage as we keep tapping down the enchanted creature. Skipping to the CMC3 slot, we have its pair of entries joining us with Timely Ward and Verity Circle. Timely Ward is an aura with flash that makes the enchanted creature indestructible, giving us an instant speed way to make our commander permanently very difficult to interact with, its flash speed helping us avoid getting 2 for 1'd. Verity Circle lets us draw a card every time an opponent's creature becomes tapped without being declared as an attacker, and lets us pay 4 and a blue to tap target non-flying creature. Its card draw being absolutely insane with just Timin on board to get 4 cards per rotation and only getting better as we add more tap-down sources, while its own tap-down effect, despite being expensive to activate, is still nice to have to add additional disruption if we have open mana. The CMC4 slot then brings us another pair of entrants with Time of Ice and Citadel Siege. Time of Ice is a saga whose first 2 chapters tap target creature an opponent controls and prevents it from untapping during its owner's next untap step, and whose last chapter bounces all tapped creatures back to their owner's hands, initially providing us with some freezing and ending with a one-sided wipe that we can tailor to hit specific creatures while dodging others with our other tap-down effects. Citadel Siege has us either choose Khans or Dragons when it ETBs. If Khans is chosen, at the start of our combat phase, we put 2 +1/+1 counters on target creature we control, and if Dragons is chosen, on each of our opponent's combat phases, we tap down a creature they control, which we'll always be choosing Dragons on to provide us with additional tap down and effectively growing Rhoda by 3 counters each turn. Finally, reaching the CMC5 slot, we have our final 2 enchantments with Octopus Umbra and Palatian Accord. Octopus Umbra is an aura with totem armor that increases the enchanted creature's base stats to 8/8 and, whenever they attack, taps down a creature with power 8 or less, serving as a spectacular way to effectively grant Rhoda a +5/+5 stat increase and attack focus tapdown effect, while also giving her a one-time protection effect by destroying itself if needed. Palatian Accord, whenever an opponent's creature becomes tapped, puts a shield counter on itself and lets us remove a shield counter from it to prevent the next one damage that would be dealt to us, giving us a tap-down payoff that, while expensive, makes it very difficult to kill us through damage once it's brought online between its damage prevention and our tap-down effects making attacking us difficult. That covers all our enchantments, so let's move on to our artifacts. The CMC1 slot opens up with Soul Ring and Wayfarer's Bauble, each of which give us some very good ramp, the former by tapping for 2 and the latter by letting us pay 2, tap it and sacking it to put a basic land from our deck into play tapped, both growing our mana base quickly and cheaply to get our commanders into play faster. Giant's Amulet then closes out this slot, an equipment that equips for 2, gives the equipped creature +0/+1 as well as hexproof if it's untapped, and lets us pay 3 and a blue as we cast it to create a 4/4 token with it attached, mainly serving as a cheap way to grant Rhoda permanent hexproof thanks to her vigilance, but it can get us a decent extra body on board if we draw into it in the later game. A whole lot of rocks then join us as we move on to the CMC2 slot, starting with Arcane Signet, which taps for any color in our commander's color identity, Azorius Signet, which we can pay 1 and tap to generate both our colors, Felwar Stone, which we can tap to produce any color an opponent's land could produce, Mind Stone, which taps for a colorless and we can pay 1 to tap it and sack it to draw a card, Thought Vessel, which taps for a colorless and removes our maximum hand size, and Prismatic Lens, which taps for a colorless and lets us pay 1 and tap it to filter a mana, all serving as cheap sources of ramp to speed up our mana base and occasionally giving us some utility to boot. Then we close out this slot with a pair of equipment, those being Swiftfoot Boots and Robe of Stars. Swiftfoot Boots equips for 1 and grants the equipped creature hexproof and haste, giving us another way to protect Rhoda from targeted removal and enabling her to get into combat immediately to start stacking up her commander damage. Robe of Stars also equips for 1, gives the equipped creature +0/+3, and lets us pay 1 and a white to phase out the equipped creature. Its defensive stat increase being okay, but its main draw being its ability to both protect Rhoda and all the enchantments and artifacts she has attached for a full turn at instant speed, without having her lose her counters in the process. Finally, reaching the CMC3 slot, we have our last 2 artifacts, with Whisper Silk Cloak and Mysterious Tome. Whisper Silk Cloak is an equipment that equips for 2, gives the equipped creature Shroud, and also makes it unblockable, providing us with not only an extra source of protection for Rhoda, but also guaranteeing that she can get in for damage even if we can't tap down all our opponent's blockers. Mysterious Tome lets us pay 2 and tap it to draw a card, which then transforms into Chilling Chronicle, which lets us pay 1 and tap it to tap target non-land permanent, then transforms back into Mysterious Tome, both its sides working nicely as repeatable and inexpensive sources of draw and tap down. That covers all our artifacts, so let's move on to our Planeswalkers. Our only Planeswalker joins us in the CMC4 slot, that being Teferi, who slows down the sun, who comes into play with 4 loyalty and has the following abilities. His +1 has us choose up to 1 of each of the following: an artifact, a creature, and a land, untapping it if it belongs to us or tapping it if it does not, while also gaining us 2 life. His -2 lets us look at the top 3 cards of our deck, putting 1 into our hand and sending the rest to the bottom of our deck in a random order. And his -7 gives us an emblem that untaps all our permanents on each of our opponent's untap steps and draws us a card on each of our opponent's draw steps, providing our build with additional tapping, card advantage, and a spectacular value-focused ult that is reasonably reachable with us constantly tapping down creatures that would usually be able to attack him. That covers our Planeswalker, so let's move on to our land base. Starting with our mana lands, we have Command Tower, which taps for any color in our commander's color identity, Skycloud Expanse, which we can pay 1 and tap to generate both our colors, Nimbus Maze, which taps for a colorless or a white or blue if we control a plains or an island respectively, Deserted Beach, which comes into play tapped unless we control 2 or more other lands and taps for either our colors, Glacial Fortress, which comes into play tapped unless we control a plains or an island and taps for either of our colors, Prairie Stream, which comes into play tapped unless we control 2 or more basic lands and taps for either of our colors, Port Town, which comes into play tapped unless we reveal a plains or an island and taps for either of our colors, Fabled Passage, which comes into play tapped and we can sack to put a basic land from our deck into play tapped, then untapping it if we control 4+ lands, and finally Myriad Landscape, which comes into play tapped, taps for a colorless, and we can pay 2, tap it and sack it to put 2 of the same basic land from our deck into play tapped. Moving on to our utility lands, we'll be running Tyrite Sanctum, Ghost Quarter, and Scavenger Grounds. Tyrite Sanctum taps for a colorless and lets us either pay 2 and tap it to give target legendary creature the god subtype and a +1/+1 counter, or pay 4, tap it and sack it to give target god an indestructible counter. allowing us to get extra counters on Rhoda and eventually making her very resilient against most forms of removal. Ghost Quarter also taps for a colorless and lets us tap it and sack it to destroy target land, letting its owner replace it with a basic from their deck, giving us a cheap way to snipe out problematic utility lands. Scavenger Grounds taps for a colorless as well, and we can pay 2, tap it and sack it to exile all cards from all graveyards, serving as a board-wide source of graveyard hate all from our land slot. Finally, we're running 11 plains and 13 islands as our basics to close out our land base. So now that we've covered all the cards in the deck, let's take a look at this deck's breakdown. This deck currently has 29 creatures including the commanders, 11 instants, 8 sorceries, 7 enchantments, 13 artifacts, 1 planeswalker, and 36 lands. Looking at the stats that matter to our game plan, we have 35 sources of tap-down effects, 8 cards that care about creatures becoming or being tapped, and 13 sources of spell disruption and protection, leaving us with plenty of means to keep our opponent's creatures tapped down alongside a handful of ways to get extra value out of it as we do so, in addition to having a decent number of ways to keep Rhoda alive as she grows to ensure that she can finish out the game for us with her commander damage. For general deck stats, we have 10 ramp sources, 10 card draw sources, 6 targeted removal sources, and 2 board wipes. Our removal being much lower than usual due to the high amount of creature disruption we're running, while our other core stats fall within acceptable parameters. Looking at our mana curve, we have 10 1-drops, 16 2-drops, 19 3-drops, 11 4-drops, 4 5-drops, 2 6-drops, and 1 7-drop, leaving us with an aggressive curve that aims to drop ramp and cheap tap-down effects early, aiming to get Timin out as quickly as possible to begin tapping down the board, to be later followed by Rhoda with hopefully some protection sources in play or counters in hand to keep her alive as she grows. Currently, this deck is valued at $65.21, not counting the price of basic lands or shipping. This price was calculated by using the cheapest listed marketplace price on TCG Player at the time of this recording. For side grades, some more repeatable sources of tap-down could easily be slotted in, such as Scorched Street Dezanin, Nimbus of Frost, and Guardian of Tenzim, each of which can tap down creatures turn after turn, while AoE sources of tap-down, such as Subjugator Angel, Ensnare, and Deluge also warrant consideration to leave our opponents vulnerable to attacks, and powering up Rhoda massively all at once to possibly knock out players out of nowhere. For upgrades, Tamiyo the Moonsage serves as a great source of tap-down and tap-down payoff in the form of card advantage all in one. Lightning Greaves and Darksteel Plate both provide Rhoda with more protection to keep her alive as she grows, while Shadow Spear not only pumps up Rhoda and lets her get through blockers, but also allows us to remove hexproof from our opponent's creatures to tap them down regardless of their defenses. Finally, we can consider upgrading our counter suite with Fierce Guardianship, Mana Drain, and even Force of Will for the superb spell disruption they provide for free or at low cost. Just be prepared to pay a lot of green despite not being in Bant. Thanks everyone for sticking around until the end of the video. Firstly, I'd like to thank all the channel subs yet again as you've been able to crack the 2.3k sub milestone. Thanks all of you for all your support, as this channel would be unable to grow without it. Moving on to the results of last week's poll, it looks like the Vampiric Noble Timothar Baron of Bats was able to claim the top spot, so look forward to a Vampiric Aristocrats focus build featuring him next week. Now looking at this week's poll, it's about time we give some of our silver medal winners a chance at gold. So this week's poll will consist of Grolnok the Omnivore, Anji Maid of Dishonor, and the partners Camber the Plunderer and Lorraine the Diversion. Please cast your vote in the community tab, link in the description, and let me know in the comments who you voted for and which commanders from Crimson Vow you'd like to see in a future poll. Before we close out, again, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't done so already, as this channel cannot grow without your support. And if you feel like showing your thanks by keeping me caffeinated while I make these videos, please consider buying me a coffee at the link in the description. Speaking of which, I'd like to thank Matt for their generous donation. Thanks for the coffee, Matt, and thanks for supporting the channel. And if any of you would like to support the channel in a different way, feel free to check out the other deck decks floating around my head if you'd like to see the latest builds, or click on the link above for a playlist of all the Cut Rate Commander episodes I've made so far. And with that, have a good one folks, and stay safe.